long before kingdoms ruled the seas, before empires controlled the world. There were warriors who came from the north, men who sailed across unknown waters, through storms, darkness, and endless horizons. They were not just explorers, they were conquerors, feared across Europe, remembered in legends. They came without warning, striking villages, burning cities, and disappearing into the sea. These were the Vikings, masters of the ocean, warriors of the north, a force that changed history forever. Welcome to History Before Us. If you enjoy exploring the rise and fall of civilizations, legendary warriors, and the untold stories of history, make sure to subscribe and join us on this journey. Now, let's go back to the beginning of the Viking Age. The world before the Vikings, long before the name Vikings echoed across Europe, before their ships appeared on distant shores, there was a harsh and unforgiving land in the north, a land of deep forests, frozen winters, and endless seas. This was Scandinavia, a region that would one day give rise to some of the most feared warriors in history. But in the beginning, there were no great raids, no legendary battles, only small communities, struggling to survive. Life in Scandinavia was not easy. The winters were long and brutal. Snow covered the land for months, and food was often scarce. The soil was not always fertile, making farming difficult, and survival depended on strength, skill, and resilience. The people who lived here were not yet known as Vikings. They were farmers, fishermen, hunters, families living in scattered villages along the coasts and fjords. Their homes were simple wooden structures, built to withstand the cold and wind. Inside, life was centered around the fire. It provided warmth, light, and a place for families to gather. But survival required more than shelter. It required adaptation. The people of the north learned to use every resource around them. They fished in icy waters. They hunted animals in dense forests. And they built strong boats to travel along rivers and coastlines. These boats would later become one of their greatest advantages. But for now, they were tools for survival. Scandinavian society was organized into small groups led by local chieftains. These leaders held power through strength and reputation. There were no large kingdoms, no unified rule, only alliances, rivalries, and constant competition. Honor and loyalty were deeply important. A man's reputation could define his place in society. Bravery was respected. Weakness was not. Conflicts between groups were common. Fights over land, resources, or honor could quickly turn into violence. But war was not the only part of their lives. These people had a rich culture and strong beliefs. They followed a religion we now call Norse mythology, a world filled with powerful gods and legendary stories. At the center of their beliefs was Odin, the god of wisdom and war, a figure both feared and respected. There was also Thor, the god of thunder, a protector of mankind, known for his strength and his mighty hammer, and Loki, the trickster, a god of chaos and unpredictability. To the people of the north, these gods were real. They shaped their understanding of the world. Storms, battles, even fate itself were believed to be influenced by these powerful beings. One of the most important ideas in their belief system was Valhalla, a great hall where warriors would go after death if they died bravely in battle. For them, death was not the end. It was a journey, and only the strongest would be chosen. This belief made them fearless, because dying in battle was not something to fear. It was something to earn. But despite their strength and culture, something was changing. By the late 8th century, pressure began to grow. Populations were increasing, resources were limited, and opportunities within Scandinavia were not enough. Young men sought more land, more wealth, more glory. At the same time, they had developed something that would change everything: the longship. Unlike any other vessel of its time, the longship was fast, flexible, and incredibly effective. It could sail across open seas, navigate shallow rivers, and land directly on shores. This meant one thing: distance was no longer a barrier. The outside world was now within reach, and beyond the seas lay lands that were rich, unprotected, and unprepared. Monasteries filled with gold and treasures, villages without strong defenses, kingdoms that had never faced an enemy like this. The stage was set. All that remained was the first move, and that moment would come in a place called Lindisfarne, a quiet island, far from the storms of the north, a place of peace, about to become the beginning of something far more dangerous, because once the Vikings began their journey, the world would never be the same again. The first raid. In the year 793 CE, something happened that would change the course of European history. Far from the cold lands of Scandinavia, on the quiet coast of northeastern England, there stood a small island, Lindisfarne. It was not a fortress, not a military outpost, but a place of peace, a monastery. For years, Lindisfarne had been a center of learning and religion. Monks lived there in isolation, dedicating their lives to prayer, writing, and preserving knowledge. They believed they were safe, protected by their faith, and by the distance from conflict. But on one day, that illusion was shattered. From the sea, strange ships appeared. Long, narrow vessels with dragon-shaped heads carved at their front. They moved quickly, silently, cutting through the water. The people on the island had never seen anything like them before, and the men inside those ships were unlike any warriors they had ever faced. The Vikings had arrived. They came without warning. There were no negotiations, no announcements, only speed and violence. The Vikings stormed the monastery. They broke through doors. They looted everything of value. Gold, silver, sacred objects, anything they could carry. The monks, unarmed and unprepared, had no way to defend themselves. Many were killed. Others were taken as slaves. The monastery was left in ruins, burned, destroyed, silenced. News of the attack spread quickly, across England and beyond. People were shocked, not just because of the violence, but because of where it had happened. A holy place had been attacked, a place believed to be under divine protection. For many, this was not just an invasion. It was a sign, a punishment, or even the beginning of something far worse. The raid on Lindisfarne is often seen as the beginning of the Viking Age. But for the Vikings, this was only the first step. They had discovered something important. The lands across the sea were vulnerable, rich but poorly defended, and most importantly, they could be reached. The longships had proven their power. These vessels were unlike anything in Europe at the time. They were fast, light, and incredibly versatile. They could cross open seas, navigate rivers, and land directly on shore. This allowed Viking warriors to strike quickly and disappear just as fast. There was no time for defense, no time for preparation. By the time an alarm was raised, the Vikings were already gone, and they would return again and again and again. After Lindisfarne, more raids followed. Monasteries along the coasts of England, Ireland, and Scotland became targets. These places were ideal. They were isolated, filled with valuable objects, and often had no protection. For the Vikings, these raids were not just about violence. They were about wealth, silver, gold, resources, things that were scarce in their homeland. But something else began to change. At first, Viking attacks were small, quick raids carried out by limited groups. But over time, they became larger, more organized, more ambitious. The Vikings were learning, they were adapting, and they were becoming more confident. European kingdoms at this point were not prepared. They were divided, focused on internal conflicts, and unfamiliar with this new type of enemy. The Vikings did not fight like traditional armies. They did not follow predictable patterns. They did not stay in one place. They were fast, unpredictable, relentless. And that made them dangerous. As the years passed, the scale of Viking activity increased. They began traveling further, reaching deeper into Europe. They sailed along rivers, entered major cities, and attacked important centers of power. The world that had once seemed distant was now open to them. But not all Vikings came only to raid. Some came to stay. Settlements began to appear in different parts of Europe, in places like Ireland, England, and even parts of France. These settlements would grow, and over time, they would change the regions they occupied. The Vikings were no longer just raiders. They were becoming settlers, traders, explorers. But for now, their reputation was clear. They were feared. Across Europe, stories began to spread. Stories of warriors from the north, men who came from the sea, who attacked without warning, who showed no mercy. To many, they were more than enemies. They were a mystery, a force that seemed unstoppable. And as fear grew, so did the legend of the Vikings. But this was only the beginning, because soon the Vikings would do something even more unexpected. They would not just raid, they would invade. Entire armies would cross the sea, not for quick attacks, but for conquest. And when that happened, the balance of power in Europe would begin to change forever. The Great Heathen Army. After the first raids on places like Lindisfarne, the people of Europe began to understand one thing. The Vikings were not just passing raiders, they were a growing threat. Year after year, Viking ships returned. They struck coastal towns, monasteries, and villages. They looted wealth and disappeared before any army could respond. But by the mid-9th century, something changed. The Vikings were no longer satisfied with quick raids. They wanted more. More land, more power, more control. And in 865 CE, that desire turned into something far more dangerous. A massive Viking force landed in England. This was not a small group of raiders. It was an army. A large, organized, and determined force known as the Great Heathen Army. The name itself carried fear. Heathen was a term used by Christians to describe those who did not follow their religion. To them, the Vikings were not just enemies. They were outsiders, pagans, a threat to both their land and their beliefs. The Great Heathen Army was made up of warriors from across Scandinavia, different clans, different leaders, united by a single goal: conquest. Among its leaders were men whose names would become legendary: Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Ubba. According to Norse tradition, these men were the sons of the famous Viking hero Ragnar Lothbrok. While some of these stories are mixed with legend, there is no doubt that these leaders played a major role in the Viking invasion of England. At the time, England was not a single united country. It was divided into several kingdoms. The most powerful among them were Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Wessex. These kingdoms often fought each other. They were not united, and that weakness made them vulnerable. When the Great Heathen Army arrived, they took advantage of this division. Instead of attacking randomly, they followed a clear strategy. They moved from kingdom to kingdom, defeating them one by one. Their first major target was East Anglia. The local king, unprepared for such a large force, chose to surrender. In exchange for peace, he provided the Vikings with horses. This gave the Viking army something new: mobility on land. Now, they were not only dangerous at sea, but also fast and powerful on land. Next, the Vikings turned their attention to Northumbria. At the time, Northumbria was already in chaos. Two rival kings were fighting for control of the throne. This internal conflict made it easy for the Vikings to attack. In 866 CE, the Great Heathen Army captured the city of York, one of the most important cities in England. When the Northumbrian kings tried to retake it, they failed. Both were killed in battle. Northumbria had fallen. From there, the Vikings moved south. They attacked the kingdom of Mercia. The Mercian king struggled to resist. Eventually, he was forced to make peace. But the Vikings were not done. They continued pushing further, expanding their control across England. Their presence was no longer temporary. They were settling, building, establishing power. Large parts of England came under Viking rule. This region became known as the Danelaw, a territory where Viking laws, culture, and leadership dominated. In these lands, Norse traditions mixed with local customs. New communities formed, and the Viking influence began to shape the future of England. But not all kingdoms fell. One remained strong: Wessex. Located in the south of England, Wessex would become the final barrier against complete Viking conquest. At its head was a young king, a leader who would become one of the most important figures in English history: Alfred the Great. Alfred understood the threat. He knew that traditional methods would not be enough to stop the Vikings, so he adapted. He reorganized his army, strengthened defenses, and built fortified towns known as burhs. These strongholds provided protection and allowed rapid response to Viking attacks. The conflict between Alfred and the Vikings would define the future of England. It was not just a battle for land. It was a battle for survival, for identity, for the future of an entire region. The Vikings had come as raiders. They had become invaders, and now they were rulers. But their expansion had not gone unnoticed, because beyond England, other parts of Europe were also beginning to feel the impact of the Viking Age, and soon the world would witness something even greater: not just invasions, but exploration. The Vikings would go further than anyone had imagined, across oceans, into unknown lands, changing history in ways that would last for centuries. Kings, conquests, and the Danelaw. By the late 9th century, the Viking presence in England had changed from scattered raids into a permanent reality. Large parts of the country were no longer ruled by Anglo-Saxon kings. They were ruled by Viking leaders. From the north and the east, the lands under their control formed what came to be known as the Danelaw. It was not just a territory, it was a different system, a different way of life. In the Danelaw, Norse customs shaped daily existence. Laws, language, and traditions blended with those of the local population. Markets bustled with trade, settlements expanded, and Scandinavian influence became deeply rooted in the land. But while the Vikings had gained control over much of England, one kingdom still resisted: Wessex. At its head was a leader unlike any the Vikings had faced before: Alfred the Great. When Alfred became king in 871 CE, Wessex was under constant threat. Viking armies had already defeated several English kingdoms, and it seemed only a matter of time before Wessex would fall as well. But Alfred refused to surrender. He understood that survival required change. Instead of relying only on traditional armies, Alfred reorganized his forces. He created a system where part of the population remained ready to fight at all times, while others maintained agriculture and daily life. This ensured that Wessex could defend itself without collapsing economically. He also strengthened defenses. Across his kingdom, Alfred ordered the construction of burhs, fortified towns designed to protect against Viking attacks. These were not simple walls. They were carefully planned defensive networks. Each burh was positioned so that no part of Wessex was too far from protection. If Vikings attacked, the population could retreat behind strong defenses, while soldiers gathered to respond. This system changed the nature of warfare. For the first time, the Vikings faced a land that was prepared, a land that could resist. But Alfred's strategy did not stop at defense. He also built a navy. Recognizing the importance of sea power, Alfred developed ships designed to counter Viking longships. These vessels were larger and more stable, allowing Wessex to challenge Viking forces along the coast. This was a turning point. The Vikings were no longer uncontested masters of the sea. The conflict between Alfred and the Viking leaders reached its peak in 878 CE. After a surprise winter attack by Viking forces led by Guthrum, Alfred was forced into hiding. For a moment, it seemed that Wessex had fallen, but Alfred did not give up. He gathered his forces quietly, reorganized, and prepared for a counterattack. At the Battle of Edington, Alfred confronted the Viking army. The battle was fierce. Shield walls clashed, swords struck, and the future of England hung in the balance. In the end, Alfred was victorious, Guthrum was defeated, and something remarkable followed. Instead of executing his enemy, Alfred offered peace. Guthrum agreed to convert to Christianity and accept a treaty. This agreement divided England between the Vikings and Wessex. The Danelaw remained under Viking control, but Wessex survived. And more importantly, it had proven that the Vikings could be stopped. From that moment forward, the balance of power began to shift. The Vikings were still strong, still present, but they were no longer unstoppable. Over the following decades, Alfred's successors continued his work. They expanded their territory, pushed back Viking control, and gradually united more of England under a single rule. But the Viking influence did not disappear. In fact, it became part of England itself. Language, culture, and even place names were shaped by Norse settlers. Words from Old Norse entered the English language. Towns with names ending in by or thorp reflected Viking origins. This blending of cultures created something new. A society influenced by both Anglo-Saxon and Viking traditions. Meanwhile, beyond England, the Vikings continued their expansion. They sailed to Ireland, establishing powerful cities such as Dublin. They raided along the coasts of France, eventually settling in a region that would become known as Normandy. They traveled deep into Eastern Europe, navigating rivers and forming trade routes that connected the Baltic Sea to the Byzantine Empire. Some even reached as far as the Middle East. The Vikings were no longer just raiders or invaders. They were traders, settlers, explorers. Their world was expanding, and their influence was spreading far beyond the shores of Scandinavia. But even as they reached new lands, something within their own society was beginning to change. The Viking Age, defined by raids and conquest, would not last forever. New kingdoms were forming, new beliefs were spreading, and the warriors of the North would soon face a transformation that would reshape their identity. The age of the Viking raider was slowly coming to an end, but their legacy was only just beginning. Explorers of the unknown. For many in Europe, the Vikings were known as raiders, men who came from the sea, bringing destruction and fear. But this was only part of their story, because beyond the battles and invasions, the Vikings were something else. They were explorers, driven by curiosity, ambition, and the need for new opportunities. They began to travel further than anyone before them. Not just across the coasts of Europe, but into the unknown. Their journeys would take them across vast oceans, into distant lands, and even to places no European had ever seen before. At the center of this expansion was one thing: the longship. It was more than just a tool for war. It was a masterpiece of engineering. Light, vast, and flexible, the longship could cross open seas while also navigating shallow rivers. It allowed the Vikings to reach places others could not, and it made exploration possible. One of the first major expansions took place to the west, across the cold and unpredictable waters of the North Atlantic. There, the Vikings discovered new lands. The first was Iceland. Around the late 9th century, Norse settlers began arriving on this remote island. Unlike the lands they had raided in Europe, Iceland offered something different: space, opportunity, a place to build a new life. Families settled there, establishing farms and communities. Over time, Iceland developed into a unique society, governed by its own laws and traditions. But the Viking journeys did not stop there. They continued further west, into even more unknown territory. This is where one of the most famous Viking explorers appears in history: Eric the Red, a man known for his boldness and his exile. After being banished from Iceland, Eric set sail westward. There, he discovered a vast and icy land. He named it Greenland. Despite its harsh conditions, Eric encouraged settlers to join him, and they did. Communities were established along the coast. Life was difficult. But for the Vikings, survival in harsh environments was nothing new. Greenland became another part of the Viking world. But beyond Greenland lay something even more extraordinary. A journey that would take the Vikings further than anyone expected. Around the year 1000 CE, Erik's son, Leif Erikson, set out on a voyage westward. Following stories of land seen by earlier sailors, Leif crossed the ocean. And he reached a place unlike any other, a land with forests, with rivers, with fertile soil. This place became known as Vinland. Today, historians believe this land was located in North America, possibly in what is now Canada. This means that the Vikings reached North America nearly 500 years before Christopher Columbus. It was an incredible achievement, a moment that showed just how far their exploration had gone. But unlike their settlements in Iceland and Greenland, Vinland did not last. Conflicts with local populations, along with the distance and difficulty of travel, made it hard to maintain. Eventually, the Vikings left, and Vinland was abandoned. Yet the story remained, a story of exploration beyond the known world. But the Viking journeys were not only toward the west. They also traveled east, through the rivers of Eastern Europe. There, they became known as the Varangians. These Viking traders and warriors moved through regions that are now Russia and Ukraine. They established trade routes connecting the Baltic Sea to the Byzantine Empire. Along these routes, they traded goods such as fur, silver, slaves, weapons. Some Vikings even entered the service of the Byzantine emperors. They became part of an elite unit known as the Varangian Guard. These warriors were trusted for their strength, loyalty, and skill in battle. This shows another side of the Vikings. Not just conquerors, but traders, mercenaries, adventurers. They adapted to different environments, different cultures, different opportunities. Wherever they went, they left an impact. They founded cities. They influenced trade. They connected distant parts of the world. The Viking Age was no longer just about raids. It had become a period of movement, of expansion, of discovery. From the icy lands of Greenland, to the rivers of Eastern Europe, to the distant shores of North America, the Vikings had pushed the boundaries of the known world. They had gone further than anyone expected, and in doing so, they had changed history. But as their world expanded, their identity began to change. The warriors of the North were no longer just raiders. They were becoming part of the societies they once attacked. They were settling, trading, building new lives. And slowly, the age of the Viking warrior was beginning to transform. The raids would continue for a time, but the world of the Vikings was evolving, and soon, a new chapter would begin, one that would bring an end to the Viking Age itself. The end of the Viking Age. For centuries, the Vikings had been a force that shaped the history of Europe. They had raided kingdoms, conquered lands, explored unknown territories, and built settlements far beyond their homeland. From the coasts of England to the rivers of Eastern Europe, from Iceland to North America, their influence had spread across vast distances. But by the 11th century, something began to change. The Viking Age, defined by raids and conquest, was coming to an end. Not in a single moment, but slowly, through transformation, through adaptation, through the very changes that had once made the Vikings so powerful. One of the most important reasons for this shift was the rise of strong European kingdoms. In earlier centuries, the lands of Europe had been divided, weak, unprepared. But over time, these kingdoms began to unite and strengthen. In England, leaders like Alfred the Great and his successors had built stronger defenses, fortified towns, organized armies, better systems of response. The Vikings could no longer strike as easily as before. Their raids became more difficult, more dangerous, less profitable. In France, Viking attacks had once been frequent and devastating. But in 911 CE, a major turning point occurred. A Viking leader named Rollo reached an agreement with the French king. In exchange for peace and protection, Rollo was granted land in northern France. This land became known as Normandy. Over time, the Vikings who settled there began to change. They adopted the local language, converted to Christianity, and became part of the society they once attacked. They were no longer seen as outsiders. They had become something new, the Normans. This transformation shows an important shift. The Vikings were no longer just raiders. They were becoming rulers and citizens. Another major change came through religion. For generations, the Vikings had followed Norse gods, Odin, Thor, Loki. Their beliefs had shaped their identity, their courage, their view of life and death. But as they settled in Christian lands, they began to convert. Gradually, Christianity spread across Scandinavia. Kings and leaders adopted the new religion. Churches were built. And over time, the old Norse beliefs began to fade. This was more than a spiritual change. It was a cultural transformation. As the Vikings became Christian, their connection to the raiding culture weakened. Their society began to resemble that of the rest of Europe. They became part of the system they once challenged. At the same time, internal changes were happening within Scandinavia itself. Small tribes and clans began to unite under stronger rulers. Kingdoms such as Denmark, Norway, and Sweden became more organized. These centralized states brought stability, and with stability came less need for raiding. Trade became more important than war. Agriculture improved. Communities grew. The Viking world was becoming more settled, more structured, less driven by the need to seek wealth through violence. But while the Viking Age was fading, it did not end quietly. There were still moments of conflict, moments that reminded the world of the power the Vikings once held. One of the most famous events marking the end of the Viking Age took place in 1066 CE, a year that would change the history of England forever. In that year, a Norwegian king named Harald Hardrada launched an invasion of England. He was one of the last great Viking leaders, a warrior known for his strength and ambition. His forces landed in northern England, and for a moment, it seemed like the Vikings might rise again. But this time, things were different. The English king, Harold Godwinson, marched north to meet him. At the Battle of Stamford Bridge, the two armies clashed. The battle was fierce. But in the end, the Vikings were defeated. Harald Hardrada was killed, and with his death, the age of Viking invasions came to an end. Just weeks later, another invasion would take place, this time from the south, led by William of Normandy, a descendant of Vikings, but no longer one himself. At the Battle of Hastings, William defeated Harold Godwinson, and England entered a new era. This moment symbolizes something powerful. The Vikings had changed the world, but they had also changed themselves. From raiders to settlers, from pagans to Christians, from outsiders to rulers. The Viking Age did not simply end, it transformed. Its people became part of the very civilizations they once attacked. Yet their legacy remained in the places they settled, in the languages they influenced, in the stories that survived. The Vikings may no longer sail across the seas, but their impact still echoes through history, and their story remains one of the most remarkable chapters in the history of the world. The legacy of the Vikings. When the Viking Age came to an end in the 11th century, it did not simply disappear. The raids stopped. The longships no longer appeared suddenly on distant shores. The warriors of the north were no longer feared in the same way. But the Vikings did not vanish, because like many great civilizations, their legacy lived on, and in many ways, it still shapes the world today. The Vikings had traveled far, far beyond what most people of their time could imagine. They had reached England, Ireland, and France. They had settled in Iceland and Greenland. They had traveled through Eastern Europe and served in distant empires. And they had even reached the shores of North America. Wherever they went, they left something behind. One of the most visible parts of their legacy is found in language. Many English words we use today come from Old Norse, the language of the Vikings. Simple words like sky, window, husband, knife, all have Viking origins. Even place names across England still reflect Viking influence. Towns ending in by, meaning village, or thorp, meaning settlement, show where Vikings once lived. In this way, the Viking presence became part of everyday life, even long after they were gone. Another important legacy is found in culture. The Vikings were known for their stories, their sagas. These were long narratives that told tales of heroes, battles, gods, and journeys. Passed down through generations, these stories preserved Viking history and beliefs. They gave us insight into how the Vikings saw the world, a world filled with honor, courage, and fate. These stories still inspire books, films, and modern storytelling today. From mythology to fantasy, the Viking imagination continues to shape creative worlds. But the Viking legacy was not only cultural, it was also political. In places like England and France, Viking settlers became rulers. In Normandy, the descendants of Viking settlers became powerful nobles. And in 1066, one of them, William the Conqueror, invaded England and changed its history forever. This shows how the Vikings transitioned from outsiders to leaders. Their influence became part of the structure of European power. In Eastern Europe, the impact was just as significant. Viking traders and warriors, known as the Varangians, helped establish early states in regions that would later become Russia. They created trade routes, built cities, and connected different parts of the world. This shows another side of the Vikings, not just warriors, but builders of networks, connectors of cultures, bringers of exchange between distant lands. The Vikings also influenced exploration. Long before the age of exploration began in Europe, the Vikings had already crossed oceans. They had navigated the Atlantic, reached Iceland, settled Greenland, and landed in North America. Their journeys proved that the world was larger than many believed. They expanded the limits of what was possible. Even though their discoveries were not fully continued at the time, they remain one of the greatest achievements of early exploration. Another lasting impact is found in shipbuilding and navigation. The Viking longship was one of the most advanced vessels of its time. Its design allowed speed, flexibility, and strength. These innovations influenced later ship designs and helped shape the future of naval travel. But perhaps the most powerful part of the Viking legacy is something less visible, something deeper. It is the idea of adaptation. The Vikings began as raiders, driven by the need for survival and opportunity. But over time, they changed. They became settlers, farmers, traders, rulers. They adapted to new environments, new cultures, new ways of life, and in doing so, they survived. Their ability to change allowed them to become part of the world they once attacked. This transformation is what allowed their legacy to endure. Because they did not resist change, they became part of it. Today, when we look back at the Vikings, we see more than warriors. We see explorers. We see creators. We see a people who pushed boundaries and redefined what was possible. Their story is not just one of violence. It is one of movement, of discovery, of transformation. From the cold lands of Scandinavia to the farthest edges of the known world, the Vikings left a mark that time could not erase. And even now, centuries later, their story continues to live on, in history, in culture, in the very fabric of the world they helped shape. And here on History Before Us, we continue telling those stories. The stories of those who came before us and changed everything. A world in transition. By the end of the Viking Age, the world they once knew was beginning to change. The longships were still there. The warriors were still strong, but something felt different. The age of sudden raids, of fire and fear, was slowly fading. In its place, a new reality was emerging. Across Scandinavia, small tribes and local clans were no longer isolated. Powerful rulers were beginning to rise. Men who did not just lead raids, but built kingdoms. In Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, authority was becoming more centralized. Kings replaced chieftains. Laws replaced traditions, and order began to take shape. This shift changed everything, because when power becomes organized, the need for chaos begins to disappear. Raiding had once been a way of life, a way to gain wealth, a way to survive. But now, there were other paths. Trade was growing, cities were forming, connections with the rest of Europe were becoming stronger. The Vikings were no longer just outsiders. They were becoming part of a larger world. In places like England and Normandy, Viking descendants had already integrated. They spoke new languages, followed new customs, built new identities, but they had not forgotten where they came from. Their strength remained. Their courage remained. Only their purpose had changed. Even their beliefs were transforming. The old gods, Odin, Thor, and Loki, were no longer the center of their world. Churches began to appear across Scandinavia. Christianity spread slowly, but steadily, and with it came new ideas, new ways of thinking, new values. The fearless warriors who once sought glory in battle were now part of a different system, a system that valued stability over conquest. But change was not easy. Not everyone accepted it. Some still held on to the old ways, to the traditions of their ancestors. to the stories of Valhalla and the gods. For them, the Viking spirit was not something to leave behind. It was something to protect. And this tension between old and new would define the final years of the Viking Age. At the same time, the world beyond Scandinavia was also evolving. European kingdoms had grown stronger. Armies were better organized. Defenses were more advanced. The element of surprise, once the Vikings' greatest weapon, was no longer enough. Raids became harder, riskier, less rewarding. The balance of power had shifted. But even as the Viking Age began to fade, their influence was still spreading. Not through war, but through presence. Their settlements remained. Their trade routes continued. Their culture blended with others. They were no longer just a force that came from the sea. They were part of the land, part of the people, part of the story, and yet there was still something unfinished. Because even as the world changed, the spirit of the Vikings had not fully disappeared. It lived on in the ambitions of leaders, in the journeys of explorers, in the desire to go further, to see more, to become more. And somewhere, in the north, new generations were growing, hearing the stories of the past, of great warriors, of distant lands, of ships that crossed dangerous seas, stories that did not speak of endings, but of beginnings, because history does not stop. It transforms, it moves forward, and sometimes it leaves behind questions. Questions about what comes next. Questions about what could still happen. The Viking Age may have been changing, but its story was not over. The last echoes of the Viking world. The Viking Age did not end with a single battle or a single king. It faded slowly, like a fire that burns strong, then begins to dim. By the early 11th century, the world that had once feared the Vikings was no longer the same. The surprise raids that had shocked Europe for generations had become less effective. Kingdoms were stronger, defenses were ready, armies were organized. The element of chaos, the very thing that made the Vikings so dangerous, was disappearing. But even as the raids declined, the Vikings themselves were far from gone. They had changed. Across Scandinavia, powerful kings were rising. Leaders who were no longer just warriors, but rulers of structured kingdoms. In Denmark, kings like Sweyn Forkbeard and later Tunt the Great expanded their influence far beyond their homeland. Nut, in particular, became one of the most powerful rulers of his time. He ruled over a vast empire that included England, Denmark, Norway. For a moment, it seemed as though a new kind of Viking power had emerged, not based on raids, but on rule. An empire not of chaos, but of control. Under Nut, the Viking legacy reached a different form. He was not seen only as a conqueror, but as a king. He supported the church, strengthened governance, and brought stability to the lands he ruled. This was a transformation. The Viking world was no longer defined by sudden attacks, but by leadership and order. Yet even this new form of power would not last. After Nut's death, his empire began to weaken. Internal struggles returned, and control over distant lands became harder to maintain. The unity he had built slowly faded. At the same time, the kingdoms of Europe continued to grow stronger. In England, new rulers emerged. In France, the Normans, descendants of Vikings, had become one of the most powerful forces in the region. They had fully adopted European customs, but their origins remained. Their strength, their ambition, their connection to the Viking past, still shaped who they were. And this connection would soon lead to one of the most important moments in history. In 1066 CE, a year that marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. It began with the death of the English king, a moment that created uncertainty, a struggle for power, a fight for the throne. Multiple leaders claimed the right to rule. Among them was Harald Hardrada, a Norwegian king, one of the last great Viking warriors. He believed the throne of England belonged to him, and he was ready to fight for it. Harald gathered his forces, sailed across the sea, and landed in northern England. For a moment, it felt like the past had returned, like the old Viking Age was rising again. The longships had come back. The warriors had come back. The threat had come back, but this was not the same world. The English king, Harold Godwinson, responded quickly. He marched his army north, and at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, the two forces met. The battle was intense, brutal, decisive. In the end, Harald Hardrada was killed. His army was defeated, and with his death, something important ended. The last great Viking invasion. But the story of 1066 was not finished, because just weeks later, another army would arrive. This time, from the south, led by William of Normandy, a man whose ancestors had once been Vikings, but who was now something else, a ruler shaped by both worlds. At the Battle of Hastings, William defeated Harold Godwinson, and England entered a new era, an era shaped not only by its own past, but by the legacy of the Vikings. This moment shows something powerful. The Viking Age did not simply end. It transformed. The warriors became rulers. The raiders became kings. The outsiders became part of the system. And through that transformation, their story continued, not in the same way as before, but in a new form, a quieter form, a deeper form. Their influence remained in the lands they had touched, in the cultures they had shaped, in the histories they had changed. The Viking ships no longer appeared on the horizon, but their legacy was everywhere. And yet, even now, there is still a question that history often leaves behind. Was this truly the end of the Viking Age, or just the beginning of something else? What remains? By the end of the 11th century, the world that had once feared the Vikings had changed forever. The longships no longer appeared suddenly on the horizon. The raids that once terrified kingdoms had become memories. The age of Viking warriors, as it had once been known, was over. But like Rome, like every great civilization, the Vikings did not simply disappear, because what they had built, what they had changed, what they had set in motion, continued even without them. Across Europe, the lands they had once attacked were no longer the same. In England, the Viking presence had reshaped the country. The Danelaw had left its mark on law, language, and society. The Norman conquest, led by descendants of Vikings, changed the future of the nation. And even centuries later, traces of Viking influence remained in everyday life. In France, the region of Normandy stood as a reminder of their transformation, a land given to Viking settlers that became one of the most powerful forces in medieval Europe. From there, their influence spread even further. In Eastern Europe, the legacy of the Varangians helped shape early states. Trade routes connected distant regions. Cities grew. Cultures mixed. The Vikings had not only traveled these lands, they had helped build them. And in the North Atlantic, their spirit of exploration left a lasting impression. Iceland remained a unique society. Greenland stood as a symbol of resilience. And even the distant memory of Vinland reminded the world of how far they had gone. But beyond geography, beyond kingdoms and borders, the Vikings left something deeper, something harder to see, but impossible to ignore. They changed the way the world moved. Before the Viking Age, many regions were isolated, disconnected, limited in contact with one another. But the Vikings broke those boundaries. They traveled across seas and rivers, connected north and south, east and west. They turned distance into opportunity, and in doing so, they helped create a more connected world. They were among the first to link these distant regions together, not through empire, but through movement, through trade, through exploration, and through the simple act of going beyond what was known. This is one of their greatest legacies, not just what they conquered, but what they connected. But their story is also a reminder of how quickly things can change. At their height, the Vikings seemed unstoppable. Their ships moved faster than any others. Their warriors struck without warning. Their reputation spread fear across continents. To those who lived in that time, it must have felt like they would always be there. But history tells us something different. Power is never permanent. Strength can fade, and even the most feared forces can become part of the past. The Vikings did not fall in a single moment. They transformed. They adapted. They became part of the world they once stood apart from. And in that transformation, their identity changed. The Viking was no longer just a raider. He was a farmer, a trader, a ruler, a citizen of a new world. And that world would continue to grow long after the Viking Age had ended. Today, when we think of the Vikings, we often imagine battle, ships cutting through waves, warriors charging into combat, but that is only part of their story, because behind the image, there is something more, a story of movement, of discovery, of transformation, a story of people who looked beyond their horizon and chose to go further, and in doing so, they changed history. But even now, their story does not feel finished, because history rarely gives us clear endings. It leaves traces, questions, echoes of what once was, and the Vikings left many echoes behind, echoes that still shape the world today. And maybe that is the real story. Not just how the Viking Age ended, but how its impact continues in ways we are still discovering, and perhaps in ways we have yet to understand. The memory of the North. When the Viking Age ended, it did not leave silence behind. It left stories. Stories carried across generations, spoken in halls lit by fire, whispered through time, until they became something more than history. They became memory. Because for the people of the North, the past was never just forgotten. It was preserved. Through words, through legends, through the sagas. These sagas were not simple tales. They were detailed accounts of lives, journeys, conflicts, and honor. Stories of kings and warriors, of betrayal and loyalty, of voyages across dangerous seas, and battles fought with courage and pride. In Iceland especially, these stories were written down, preserved in manuscripts that would survive for centuries. Without them, much of what we know about the Vikings would have been lost. But the sagas did more than record events. They shaped identity. They told people who they were and where they came from. They gave meaning to the past. And through them, the Viking world continued to live on. In these stories, heroes stood larger than life. Men like Ragnar Lothbrok, a legendary warrior whose tale blurred the line between myth and reality. Or Leif Erikson, the explorer who sailed west into lands unknown. Their stories were told again and again, changing slightly with each telling, but never losing their power. Because the truth was not always the most important part. What mattered was the meaning behind the story, the values it carried: honor, courage, strength, the willingness to face the unknown. These were the qualities the Vikings respected, and these were the qualities their stories preserved. But the memory of the Vikings was not only kept in words, it was carved into stone. Across Scandinavia, runestones still stand, covered in inscriptions and symbols. They marked the lives of those who came before: warriors, travelers, families. Each stone tells a story, a name, a journey, a moment frozen in time. Some speak of battles, others of voyages to distant lands. Some honor the dead, others celebrate the living. Together, they form a map of memory, a way for the past to remain present, even as the world changed. And the world did change. The Viking Age had ended. New kingdoms had formed. New beliefs had spread. Christianity had replaced the old gods. The longhouses were replaced by churches. The old rituals faded, but the memory did not. Because memory does not disappear easily. It adapts. It survives. It finds new forms. In medieval Europe, the image of the Viking changed. To some, they were still seen as brutal raiders, symbols of destruction. But to others, they became something more: figures of fascination, of mystery, of power. Their reputation grew beyond reality, and over time, it became legend. Centuries later, during the Renaissance, scholars rediscovered the ancient past. They studied Rome, Greece, and the cultures that came after. The Vikings became part of that rediscovery, not as a threat, but as a subject of history. Their journeys, their stories, their impact began to be understood in a new way. And then, in the modern world, something even more interesting happened. The Vikings returned, not in ships, not with swords, but through culture, books, films, art, stories that brought them back to life. They became symbols of adventure, of exploration, of fearless movement into the unknown. Their image evolved once again, from feared warriors to iconic figures. But behind all these versions, there is still the real story. A story of people who lived in a harsh land, who adapted to survive, who looked beyond their horizon and chose to cross it, who became more than what they started as. And that is why their memory remains so powerful. Because it is not just about what they did, it is about what they represent. The human desire to explore, to expand, to push beyond limits, to leave something behind. And the Vikings did exactly that. They left something behind, not just in the lands they touched, but in the way we think about history. Because through their story, we are reminded that history is not just events. It is people, choices, journeys, and the stories we choose to remember. The Viking Age may be over, but its memory is still alive. And as long as those stories are told, it always will be. The story continues. When we look back at the Viking Age, it may seem like a chapter that has already ended. A distant time of warriors, ships, and raids. A story that belongs only to the past, but history is rarely that simple. Because the truth is, the Viking story did not end. It continued. Not in the same way. Not with longships crossing the sea or warriors storming distant shores, but in quieter ways, deeper ways, ways that are still shaping the world today. After the Viking Age, the lands of Scandinavia did not fall into silence. They evolved. Kingdoms became stronger. Governments became more organized. Societies became more structured. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden grew into established nations, no longer defined by raids, but by stability, trade, and connection with the rest of Europe. The same people who once looked outward for opportunity now built their future at home, but their outward spirit never disappeared. That desire to explore, to move, to discover, remained part of their identity. And over time, that spirit would take new forms, not through conquest, but through exploration. Centuries later, European explorers would cross oceans, discover new lands, and connect continents. And while these explorers were not Vikings, they followed a path that had already been opened. A path of curiosity, of risk, of movement into the unknown. The Vikings were among the first to take those steps. They showed that the world was larger than it seemed, that beyond every horizon, there could be something new. And that idea would shape the future of exploration. But the Viking influence was not only about movement, it was also about identity. In many parts of Europe, especially in England and France, Viking ancestry became part of the population. Generations passed, languages changed, cultures blended, but the roots remained, hidden but present, in names, in traditions, in the way societies developed. The Viking world did not disappear. It became part of something bigger, part of Europe, part of history, part of us. And even today, we continue to return to their story, not just because of what they did, but because of what they represent. Strength, freedom, the courage to leave what is known and face what is not. In a way, the Vikings reflect something deeply human. The desire to move forward, to go further, to build something beyond ourselves. And that is why their story still matters. Because it speaks to something timeless. But there is another side to this story, a more complex one. Because the Viking Age was not only about exploration and courage, it was also about conflict, destruction, struggle, lives lost, worlds changed. Like many powerful forces in history, the Vikings left both creation and destruction behind. And understanding them means understanding both sides, the strength and the cost. This is what makes their story real. Not perfect, not simple, but true. And as we look at the world today, we can still see the echoes of their journey in the way societies connect, in the way cultures mix, in the way people continue to explore. The Viking Age may have ended, but its impact continues, not as a memory alone, but as a part of the ongoing story of humanity. Because history does not stop. It moves. It evolves. It carries forward the actions of those who came before. And every generation adds something new. The Vikings were one chapter, a powerful one, a transformative one, but not the final one. Because the story is still being written, and just like those who once stood on the shores of Scandinavia, looking out at the unknown sea, we too are part of that journey, moving forward, exploring, changing the world in our own way. And somewhere in that movement, the spirit of the Vikings still lives on, beyond the horizon. In the end, the story of the Vikings is not just about what they did, but about how far they were willing to go. Because from the very beginning, the people of the North lived on the edge of something greater. The edge of land, the edge of survival, the edge of the unknown. And instead of turning away from that edge, they stepped forward. They built ships. They crossed waters that others feared. They followed no maps, no clear paths, only the instinct that something existed beyond the horizon. And that choice changed everything. The Viking Age was not created by a single king or a single battle. It was created by movement, by individuals who chose to leave their homes and search for something more land, more wealth, more meaning. But what they found was not always what they expected. They found resistance, new cultures, different worlds. Sometimes they conquered, sometimes they settled, sometimes they simply passed through, leaving only traces behind. But each journey added something. Each voyage changed the map of the known world. And over time, those changes became permanent. The Vikings connected places that had never been connected before. They carried ideas across distances that once seemed impossible. They proved that the world was not as limited as people believed. And in doing so, they expanded the idea of what was possible. But as their world grew, so did the challenges they faced. Because exploration is never without risk. The seas were dangerous. Storms could destroy ships. Journeys could end in failure, and not every expedition returned. The Vikings understood this. They knew the cost, and yet they continued, because the drive to move forward was stronger than the fear of what lay ahead. This is what makes their story different. It is not just a story of war. It is a story of courage. The courage to leave everything behind and face the unknown. But over time, the need to explore changed. The world became more connected. Trade routes became established. Kingdoms became stable. And the age of constant movement began to slow. The Viking no longer needed to sail into the unknown to survive. The unknown was becoming known. The world they had helped open was now being understood. And as that happened, their role began to change. They became part of the world they had once explored. Settlers, citizens, participants in a larger system. The Viking Age, as a period of exploration and expansion, had reached its end. But its impact remained. Because every journey leaves something behind. Every step into the unknown changes what comes next. The Vikings did not just discover new lands. They changed how people thought about distance, about possibility, about the limits of the world. And that change continued long after they were gone. Centuries later, explorers would cross oceans again, sail further, discover more. But they were not starting from nothing. They were following a path that had already been opened. A path created by those who dared to go first. And that is the true legacy of the Vikings. Not just the lands they reached, but the idea they left behind. That beyond every horizon, there is something more, something waiting to be discovered, something that can only be found by those willing to move forward. And that idea does not belong to the past. It belongs to every generation, because even today, we still stand at our own horizons, facing our own unknowns, making our own choices, and just like the Vikings, we decide whether to stay or to go further. And maybe that is where their story truly continues, the meaning of the journey. When we look back at the Vikings, it is easy to remember the battles, the longships cutting through the sea, the sudden raids, the warriors feared across distant lands. But if we look deeper, their story is not only about war. It is about something more enduring. It is about the journey, because the Vikings were not defined only by where they came from, but by where they chose to go. They lived in a land that was harsh and demanding, a place that did not easily provide, a place that forced its people to adapt, to survive, to move. And from that environment, a mindset was born, a mindset that refused to stay still, that refused to accept limits, that looked at the horizon and saw possibility. This is what drove the Vikings, not just the search for wealth, but the search for something beyond what they already knew. And that search changed them. At first, they were small communities, farmers and fishermen, living within the boundaries of their land. But once they began to move, everything expanded. Their world grew larger. Their identity grew stronger. Their story became something greater, because movement changes perspective. When they traveled to new lands, they encountered new ideas, new cultures, new ways of life, and each encounter left a mark, sometimes through conflict, sometimes through exchange, but always through connection. Over time, the Vikings were no longer just people of the North. They became part of a wider world, a world shaped by interaction, by influence, by shared experience. And this is where their journey takes on a deeper meaning, because it reflects something that goes beyond a single civilization. It reflects a pattern we see throughout history, the movement of people, the crossing of boundaries, the transformation that comes from stepping into the unknown. The Vikings were not the first to do this, and they were not the last, but they were among the most visible, among the most impactful, because they moved not just across land, but across limits. They challenged the idea of what was possible. They showed that distance could be overcome, that isolation could be broken, that the world was not fixed, but open. And that idea is powerful, because it continues to shape how we think today. Exploration did not end with the Vikings. It continued, across oceans, across continents, into new frontiers. But the spirit behind it remains the same. The desire to go further, to understand more, to discover what lies beyond. And yet, every journey also has a cost. The Viking Age was not only about discovery, it was also about conflict. Communities were destroyed, lives were lost, cultures were disrupted. Like many forces in history, the Vikings brought both change and consequence. And understanding their story means recognizing both sides, the courage and the impact, the movement and the cost. Because history is never simple. It is made of choices. and every choice shapes what comes next. As the Viking Age came to an end, the journeys did not stop. They changed direction, from raiding to settlement, from conquest to integration, from isolation to connection. The Vikings became part of the very world they had once entered as outsiders. And in doing so, their journey became complete. Not because it ended, but because it transformed. From movement to meaning, from action to legacy. And that is what remains. Not just the image of warriors on ships, but the idea of what they represented. The willingness to move forward, to take risks, to step beyond what is known, and to accept whatever comes after. Because in the end, the story of the Vikings is not just about the past. It is about something that continues, something that exists in every generation. The moment when we stand at the edge of what we know and decide whether to stay or to go further. The end and the beginning. In the end, the story of the Vikings is not a story of a single moment. It is not defined by one battle, or one king, or one journey. It is something larger, something that unfolds across centuries. From the cold shores of Scandinavia to the distant lands they reached, the Vikings changed the course of history. They arrived without warning. They struck with speed and force. And for generations, they were feared across Europe. But that was only one part of their story, because behind the image of the warrior, there was something deeper, a people shaped by their environment, by the need to survive, by the desire to move beyond what they had. And it was that desire that led them to the sea. The sea became their path, their connection to the world, their gateway to everything beyond. And through it, they transformed. They became explorers, travelers, builders of new worlds. They did not simply take from the lands they reached. They became part of them. In England, in France, in Eastern Europe, their presence changed societies, not just through conquest, but through connection. Languages blended, cultures mixed, new identities were formed, and over time, the Viking was no longer an outsider. He became part of the world he once entered as a stranger. This is where their story truly changes. Because the Viking Age did not end in defeat. It ended in transformation. The raids slowed, the ships stopped arriving, the fear faded. But the people remained. They adapted. They evolved. They became something new. And that is what allowed their legacy to survive. Because survival is not always about strength. Sometimes it is about change. The Vikings understood this. Even if they did not see it in those terms. They moved when they needed to. They fought when they had to. They settled when the time came. And in doing so, they ensured that their story would continue. Not as invaders, but as part of history itself. Today, when we look back at the Vikings, we see more than warriors. We see a reflection of something human, the need to explore, the courage to face the unknown, the ability to adapt when the world changes. These are not just Viking traits. They are human traits. And that is why their story still matters. Because it connects the past to the present. It shows us that history is not just a record of events. It is a reflection of who we are and how we respond to the challenges we face. The Vikings stood at the edge of their world and chose to go further. They crossed oceans, faced dangers, changed the lands they reached, and in the process, they changed themselves. That is their legacy, not just the places they touched, but the example they left behind, an example of movement, of courage, of transformation, because every generation faces its own horizon, its own unknown, its own moment of decision. And just like the Vikings, we choose what comes next. We choose whether to remain where we are or to move forward, to explore, to build, to change the world in our own way. The Viking Age may have ended, but the spirit behind it has not. It lives on in every journey we take, in every boundary we cross, in every step we make into the unknown. And that is why their story is not just a part of history, it is a part of something much bigger, something that never truly ends, because in the end, this was never just the story of the Vikings. It was the story of movement, the story of change, the story of what happens when we dare to go beyond what we know. And that story is still being written.